Ron Morehead has been researching Bigfoot longer than most people in the field have been alive. The Sierra Sounds recordings he captured decades ago remain the most significant audio evidence in the history of Bigfoot research. When he joined the Alaskan Killer Bigfoot investigation, he brought that lifetime of accumulated knowledge into the most hostile wilderness environment the research has ever been conducted in. What the investigation found exceeded everything that Lifetime had prepared him for. Subscribe and stay until the very end, because what the network has been sitting on changes everything. Ron Morehead's position in the Bigfoot research community is not the position of a television personality whose paranormal investigation credentials were built inside a production format. It is the position of a man whose engagement with the Bigfoot question predates the paranormal television genre entirely, whose most significant contribution to the evidence base for Bigfoot's existence was produced decades before any network had decided that the subject was worth putting in front of a cable television audience. The Sierra Sounds recordings are the foundation of that position. Captured in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California across multiple field sessions in the 1970s, the Sierra Sounds represent the most extensively analyzed body of alleged Bigfoot vocalizations in the research community's history. A set of audio recordings whose acoustic properties have been subjected to independent analysis by linguists, acoustic specialists, and cryptolinguistic researchers whose combined assessment has consistently produced the finding that the sounds were generated by a vocal apparatus significantly larger than any known North American primate species and containing structural complexity consistent with intentional communication rather than instinctive animal vocalization. Ron Morehead was there when those recordings were made. He was not a researcher who arrived after the fact to analyze evidence produced by someone else. He was the field investigator whose sustained presence at the Sierra Nevada location across multiple seasons produced the conditions under which the vocalizations were captured, whose relationship to the location and to whatever was producing the sounds had developed across enough time and enough direct engagement to produce recordings of the quality and the duration that the Sierra Sounds represent. That history is the foundation of the credibility his involvement in the Alaskan Killer Bigfoot investigation carries. When Ron Morehead says that what the investigation found in Alaska exceeded everything his prior research had prepared him for, when the man whose Sierra Sounds recordings have been the benchmark of significant Bigfoot audio evidence for decades characterizes a new investigation's findings as exceeding that benchmark, the characterization carries a weight that no other voice in the research community can provide. He is not comparing what the Alaskan investigation found to the general body of Bigfoot evidence whose quality varies enormously across the research community's accumulated record. He is comparing it to the Sierra Sounds. He is saying that what the network has been sitting on since the Alaskan Killer Bigfoot investigation concluded is more significant than the most significant Bigfoot audio evidence ever produced. That comparison is what this video is going to establish in full, and the process of establishing it begins with understanding why Ron Morehead's voice is the one that makes the comparison meaningful. Alaska is not simply a more remote version of the Pacific Northwest investigation environments that Finding Bigfoot, Expedition Bigfoot, and the broader Bigfoot field research community have spent decades working in. It is a categorically different investigation environment whose specific characteristics, the scale of the wilderness, the absence of the human infrastructure that shapes every other Bigfoot investigation environment in the lower 48 states, the climate conditions, and the specific character of the wildlife and ecological systems that the Alaskan interior supports, produce investigation conditions that no comparable show or research program has operated in at the scale and with the depth of penetration into the wilderness that the Alaskan Killer Bigfoot investigation achieved. The scale of the Alaskan wilderness is the first and most fundamental difference. The Pacific Northwest environments where the majority of significant Bigfoot field research has been conducted are vast by the standards of the continental United States, but are accessible, mapped, and surrounded by the human infrastructure of a region whose population density, however low by comparison to more developed areas, maintains a presence in the landscape that shapes the behavior of everything living in it. The Alaskan interior is not shaped by human presence in the same way. The wilderness systems the Alaskan Killer Bigfoot investigation penetrated are environments where the human footprint is genuinely minimal, where the absence of roads, of permanent habitation, and of the sustained human activity that conditions wildlife behavior in every other investigation environment produces a landscape in which whatever is present has been operating without significant human interference across a timescale that the accessible wilderness of the Pacific Northwest cannot match. The behavioral implications of that difference are significant for understanding what the investigation found. An organism that has been operating in an environment with minimal human contact across generations will behave differently toward human investigators than an an organism whose territory has been intersected by human activity across the same period. The prior research community's experience has been conducted almost entirely in the second category of environment. The Alaskan investigation operated in the first. What that produced in terms of the investigation team's direct encounters with whatever was operating in the Alaskan wilderness, the proximity, the frequency, and the behavioral character of what the investigation documented is the dimension of the findings whose significance Ron Morehead's prior research experience gave him the specific framework to assess, and that the network has been sitting on since the investigation concluded. The Alaska evidence is different not just in quantity but in kind. And the kind it represents is what Morehead's exposure addresses directly. The Alaskan Killer Bigfoot investigation assembled a team whose combined field experience and research background represented the most credentialed group of investigators the show's production format had deployed. DJ Brewster, Ash Naderhall, Keith Seville, Kyle McDowell, Jefferson Davis, Tommy Evans, and Noah Craig brought individual expertise across the range of investigation disciplines the show's methodology required: field tracking, historical research, forensic evidence collection, wilderness survival, and the practical woodsmanship that sustained presence in the Alaskan interior demands from anyone operating in it. Ron Morehead's contribution to that team was different in character from every other team member's contribution. Not more valuable in the operational sense of field investigation, but more significant in the interpretive sense of what the investigation's findings meant against the backdrop of the complete Bigfoot evidence record that his decades of research had given him access to. His acoustic research background is the most immediately relevant dimension of what he brought. The Sierra Sounds recordings and the subsequent acoustic analysis work that he has conducted across the decades since their capture had given him a detailed and practical understanding of the specific acoustic signatures that Bigfoot vocalizations produce, the frequency ranges, the harmonic structures, the respiratory characteristics, and the specific qualities that distinguish genuine Bigfoot audio evidence from the misidentification and fabrication sources that contaminate the broader audio evidence record. That understanding gave him the ability to assess the acoustic evidence the Alaskan investigation produced in real time, and against the most significant comparative baseline in the research community's history, the Sierra Sounds themselves. When the investigation's audio equipment captured vocalizations in the Alaskan wilderness, Ron Morehead was the person present whose prior research had given him the framework to immediately and accurately characterize what the equipment had recorded. His assessment of the Alaskan audio evidence, delivered in real time during the investigation and documented in the production record, is the element of the investigation's findings whose significance the network has been most specifically sitting on. Because what he said about the Alaskan vocalizations in comparison to the Sierra Sounds is the assessment that the research community's most credible voice in the audio evidence domain has ever produced about any Bigfoot acoustic evidence. And it has not been broadcast. The network has been sitting on it, and Ron Morehead is now exposing what it says. The Alaskan Killer Bigfoot investigation conducted multiple field sessions across a geographic range whose depth of penetration into the Alaskan interior exceeded what the show's production format had established as its standard operational scope in prior sessions. The sessions that produced the evidence whose existence and character Ron Morehead's exposure addresses were not the standard deployment sessions whose findings the broadcast episodes presented within the show's investigation format. They were the sessions conducted at the specific locations within the investigation area whose prior evidence profile, the accumulated witness accounts, the physical trace evidence, and the acoustic history of specific terrain features in the Alaskan wilderness had identified as the highest probability encounter zones in the investigation's full operational area. The preparation for those sessions reflected the investigation team's understanding that what they were approaching was different in character from the standard Bigfoot investigation environment. The team's load-in for the deep penetration sessions included acoustic monitoring equipment whose deployment Ron Morehead directed with the specific methodology his Sierra Sounds fieldwork had developed, positioning designed to capture vocalizations from multiple independent angles simultaneously, providing the overlapping acoustic coverage that would give any recorded sounds the multi-source documentation necessary to eliminate single microphone artifact explanations. The session that produced the most significant audio evidence began in the late afternoon of the investigation's third day at the primary location, a specific terrain feature whose combination of elevation, watershed position, and forest canopy characteristics Morehead had identified from the prior evidence profile as the most likely focal point of whatever was operating in the area. The environmental baseline timeline documentation conducted at the start of the session established something that the investigation team noted and that the subsequent events made significant in retrospect. The ambient acoustic environment of the location was unusually quiet, not the ordinary quiet of a wilderness environment in calm conditions. A specific, directional quiet, the absence of the bird and small animal activity that the surrounding terrain had been producing consistently, concentrated around the terrain feature that the session was targeting. Ron Morehead recognized the specific quality of that quiet immediately. It was the same quality that had preceded the most significant vocalization events during the Sierra Nevada field sessions decades earlier. Something at the location was producing a behavioral suppression effect on the surrounding wildlife, and that effect was concentrated at the point in the terrain that the investigation had identified as the session's primary target. The session's audio equipment was running at full deployment when the first sound arrived, and what it captured in the following 2 hours is what the network has been sitting on. The first vocalization captured by the Alaskan Killer Bigfoot investigation's audio equipment during the primary location session arrived 47 minutes into the active monitoring period. It came from the northern approach corridor of the terrain feature, a direction that the session's monitoring deployment had covered with 2 independent units whose overlapping capture range gave the recording a 2-source documentation foundation whose significance the subsequent acoustic analysis would establish as critical to the evidence's evidential quality. The vocalization was not subtle, not the distant, ambiguous audio event that the field research community's typical encounter record is dominated by, the sound at the edge of audibility whose distance and atmospheric conditions allow multiple interpretations. It was close. The distance estimate that the audio specialist produced from the recording's amplitude and the known acoustic properties of the terrain placed the source within 300 meters of the monitoring equipment's nearest unit, and it was structured. The harmonic complexity of what the audio captured in those first seconds was identifiable even in the raw recording as something whose production required a vocal apparatus of significant sophistication, not a simple tonal sound but a layered, harmonically organized vocalization whose internal structure communicated intentionality rather than instinct. Ron Morehead heard it in real time through his monitoring headset. The people who were present describe his response in consistent terms. Not excitement, not the performed enthusiasm of a television personality encountering dramatic evidence, but a specific focused stillness whose character the people who have worked alongside him in field conditions have learned to recognize as the response of a researcher who has encountered something significant and is applying his full analytical attention to characterizing it accurately before saying anything about it. He listened to the first vocalization through its complete duration without speaking. He listened to the second vocalization, which arrived 11 minutes later from a different position in the terrain, indicating movement of the source between the 2 events, with the same focused attention. Then he said something that the production's recording infrastructure captured, and that the network has been sitting on since the investigation concluded. He compared what the equipment had just recorded to the Sierra sounds, not in general terms, not the loose comparison of someone noting a general similarity between 2 audio events in the same evidential category. A specific technical comparison whose content reflected the acoustic analysis framework his decades of Sierra Sounds research had developed, and that he applied to the Alaskan recording in real time with the same rigor he had applied to the Sierra material across years of post-capture analysis. What the comparison produced, what Ron Morehead said about the relationship between the Alaskan vocalizations and the Sierra sounds and the specific technical terms that his research background gave him the vocabulary to articulate, is the most significant statement any credible Bigfoot researcher has ever made about any piece of Bigfoot audio evidence. And it is in the production record, and the network has been sitting on it. The audio evidence captured during the primary location session was not the only significant finding the Alaskan Killer Bigfoot investigation produced at the terrain feature that the deployment had identified as the session's focal point. The physical evidence documentation conducted in the session's aftermath, the systematic examination of the terrain in the areas corresponding to the audio source locations that the recording analysis had established, produced a body of physical trace evidence whose character and whose quality corroborated the audio findings in a way that the research community's standard of significant evidence requires. The track evidence found at the northern approach corridor, the direction from which the first vocalization had arrived, was documented by the investigation team under the methodological protocols that the show's field research standards specified for significant physical evidence finds. The impressions in the soft ground of the approach corridor were fresh. The edge definition and the moisture infiltration characteristics that experienced track analysts used to estimate impression age placed them within the same session time frame as the audio events. Their dimensional profile placed them outside the size range of every known North American species. The anatomical characteristics that the most rigorous track analysis methodology examines, the toe distribution pattern, the arch structure, the pressure gradient distribution across the impression, were assessed by the team members whose field research backgrounds gave them the relevant analytical framework, and their assessments converged on a characterization that the physical evidence record the prior seasons of the show had accumulated did not provide a precedent for in terms of the combination of evidence quality and evidence quantity the session produced. The biological material recovered from the approach corridor in proximity to the track evidence is the element of the physical evidence record, whose laboratory analysis results Ron Morehead's exposure addresses most specifically. Hair samples collected under the sterile protocols that the investigation's evidence collection methodology required were submitted for forensic genetic analysis under the blind submission process that the prior analysis of significant biological evidence in comparable investigations had established as the necessary condition for producing results that could withstand the scrutiny the research community's evidential standards demand. The results came back. Their specific content, the mitochondrial and nuclear sequence analysis, the GenBank database matching, and the species identification conclusion that the laboratory's forensic methodology produced is in the investigation's complete evidence record. Ron Morehead has seen those results. His exposure addresses what they established, and what they established is what the network has been sitting on alongside the audio comparison that his real-time field assessment produced. Discovery Channel's decision to retain the most significant elements of the Alaskan Killer Bigfoot investigation's evidence record without broadcasting them is the institutional decision whose existence Ron Morehead's exposure establishes and whose character the exposure's account of what the evidence contains makes comprehensible. Networks do not suppress evidence from their own productions without a reason whose specific character the suppression decision reflects. The reason Discovery Channel has been sitting on the Alaskan Killer Bigfoot evidence is not ambiguity about its authenticity. The forensic authentication process is applied to both the audio evidence and the physical evidence record-produced findings, whose quality the network's own review of the investigation materials established as beyond the standard objections that the skeptical community applies to Bigfoot evidence as a category. The reason is not legal exposure. The investigation was conducted on accessible terrain under operational protocols, whose legal framework the production's infrastructure had established before the sessions began. The reason is what the evidence establishes. What the audio comparison Ron Morehead made in real time at the investigation site establishes about the relationship between the Alaskan vocalizations and the Sierra sounds. What the forensic genetic analysis of the biological samples establishes about the species identity of whatever produced the physical trace evidence at the northern approach corridor, and what the combined evidence, the audio, the physical traces, the biological samples, and the real-time expert assessment of the most credentialed Bigfoot researcher in the field establishes about the question that the Alaskan Killer Bigfoot show was built around, and that the network's commercial relationship to the show had always been predicated on remaining open. A network whose programming is built around the dramatic tension of an ongoing search has a specific commercial relationship to the evidence that the search produces. Evidence that advances the search creates the next season. Evidence that answers the question the search is built around creates a problem, the specific commercial problem of a franchise whose central premise has been resolved in a way that the ongoing search format cannot accommodate. Discovery Channel has been sitting on the Alaskan Killer Bigfoot evidence because what it establishes is the answer rather than the next chapter. And the answer, in the commercial framework of a cable television production whose value to the network depends on the question remaining open, is a problem rather than a product. Ron Morehead's exposure is the decision that the answer deserves to be heard, regardless of what its hearing costs the commercial framework that has been containing it. Ron Morehead's exposure changes the Alaskan Killer Bigfoot record in a specific and consequential way, not by contradicting what the broadcast episodes contain. Those findings are real, and the investigation team's professional standards established their quality across multiple sessions. It changes the record by establishing the broadcast episode's relationship to the complete investigation. What the audience watched was the managed fraction of a complete evidence record whose most significant findings, the audio comparison, the biological sample analysis, The real-time expert assessment of the research community's most credentialed acoustic evidence specialist are in an archive the network has been sitting on. That confirmation changes everything about how the show's audience understands what they watched. And for the broader research community, Morehead's exposure is the most significant communication the field has ever received about any investigation's findings. Not a general claim, a specific technical comparison made by the man best positioned to make it between the Sierra Sounds and something that exceeded them. That comparison is now public. The network's containment of the complete record cannot walk it back. Ron Morehead spent decades pursuing the Bigfoot question through the methodology his Sierra Sounds work developed. Alaska gave him the most extreme and uncontaminated investigation environment the research has ever been conducted in. What he found there exceeded everything that methodology had previously produced. The network has been sitting on it because what it establishes resolves the question the show was built around in a way the commercial framework cannot accommodate. Morehead is exposing it because what it establishes belongs in the public record, regardless of what containing it requires. He is 50-plus years into a research career organized around one question. The Alaskan investigation produced the most significant evidence that career has ever encountered. The exposure is now public. What the network has been sitting on can no longer be sat on, and what it shows is the answer that decades of Sierra Sounds research was building toward. It has always been in Alaska. Ron Morehead just made sure the world knows it.